All right, listener. So you want to know how to make those UK construction projects wrap up faster, huh? We're diving deep into this RICS guidance on acceleration, fresh from February 2024. Think of it as your cheat sheet for speeding things up the right way.
This guidance is a goldmine of insights from industry experts, so we'll break it down so you can use it on your projects.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll not only be able to define acceleration, but you'll know how to deal with those tricky contract situations and have a handle on what actually works on site. But first things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say acceleration in construction? I mean, it's not just everyone downing energy drinks and pulling all-nighters, is it?
You're on the right track there. It's not just about working faster. It's more about strategically speeding up the project to hit that earlier finish line. And that means careful planning and knowing how your contracts deal with this.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just a mad dash to the end. I can see how that could go wrong without a clear plan. So when does acceleration actually make sense? I mean, is it always a good idea?
It's definitely not something you just jump into for the fun of it. Sometimes it's a necessity, like when you're trying to avoid those big penalties for delays, or maybe you need to free up your STAR team for other projects. Or maybe, just maybe, your client absolutely needs that building up and running ASAP.
Makes sense. So it's a strategic move, not just the default. Now, I'm guessing contracts have a lot to say about all this. What's the legal side of things look like when we talk acceleration?
Oh, contracts are key here. And in the UK, you've got different approaches depending on which contract you're using. We've got the big three: JCT, NEC4, and ICC.
Okay, break it down for me. What are the big differences?
Let's start with that JCT standard building contract. It's all about those formal acceleration quotations from the contractor. So imagine you get this detailed quote outlining the extra cost and the time adjustments before you even start speeding things up. It's about having that clear agreement from the get-go.
Interesting. So it's like getting a price check before you hit the gas on the project?
Mm-hmm.
What about NEC? How does that one handle things?
NEC4 is all about being proactive. It's got these core clauses for acceleration, so the rules for speeding things up are built right into the contract. Think of it like having that pre-approved plan ready to go in case you need to accelerate.
Ah, so it's about having those acceleration tools built in rather than scrambling to figure things out later. And what about ICC? How does that one approach acceleration?
With the infrastructure conditions of contract, or ICC, the employer can ask for acceleration, but here's the catch. Everything needs to be agreed on in writing before anything happens. So think about those new completion dates, the costs, all the details, everything in black and white to avoid any nasty surprises down the line.
Yeah, I can see how having all those details documented up front could save you some headaches later on. Okay, so we've talked about the why behind acceleration and the contract side of things, but now I'm curious about how this plays out in the real world. How do you actually make a project go faster on a construction site?
Now that's where things get really interesting. It's not just about everyone working longer hours, although that can be a part of it. There's a whole bunch of strategies you can use, and the best approach really depends on the project itself and what challenges you're facing.
All right, give us a sneak peek. What are some of the strategies you've got up your sleeve?
Well, extending working hours is one option. That could mean adding shifts, working weekends, or maybe just strategically focusing those extra hours on the tasks that will really make a difference. But remember, it's not just about clocking in more time, it's about using that time effectively.
Yeah, I see your point. So it's about being smart with those extra hours, not just throwing more time at the problem and hoping for the best. What other strategies are out there?
Another common approach is bringing in more resources, getting more workers on board. But it's not as simple as just adding bodies. You need to think about supervision, materials, even just the physical space for those extra workers. It can get complicated quickly if you don't manage it carefully.
Right, like a delicate ecosystem. You tweak one thing, and it can have ripple effects all over the project. What else can you do?
You can also think about changing up the project schedule. That could mean overlapping certain tasks, tweaking the order of things, or even bringing in certain stages earlier than you planned. It's like rearranging a giant puzzle to find a quicker solution.
I'm starting to get a sense of how much strategy and planning goes into this. It's more than just work faster, it's work smarter. Are there any other maybe more creative approaches to acceleration?
Oh, absolutely. Think about things like temporary works, things like protective screens, so you can keep working even if the weather's bad. Or maybe switching materials to speed up drying times, like using plasterboard instead of rendering. And sometimes you can even tweak the design, simplifying some of the details, and that can shave weeks off your timeline.
Wow, that's a lot to think about already. It's clear that acceleration is more than meets the eye, but I'm guessing it's not always smooth sailing. Are there any potential pitfalls or challenges that people should be aware of when they're considering acceleration?
You're right, it's not all sunshine and roses. Acceleration can be a powerful tool, but like any tool, you need to use it carefully. There are definitely some downsides if you're not prepared.
Okay, let's talk about those. What are some things that could go wrong with acceleration?
One of the big things is risk allocation. Your contract needs to be crystal clear about who's responsible if things don't go according to plan during the acceleration process. You need to know who takes the hit if there are delays, extra costs, or even potential damage. It needs to be spelled out.
That makes a lot of sense. You don't want to end up in a blame game when the pressure's on. What else should people watch out for?
Those cost quotations we talked about earlier, they need to be very detailed and transparent. A lump sum quote might seem easier at first, but an itemized quote, where each cost element is broken down, gives everyone a much clearer understanding and helps prevent disagreements down the road.
So it's like choosing between a fixed menu and ordering a la carte. Sometimes it's better to see each individual cost, especially in something as complex as construction. Anything else to keep in mind?
Absolutely. Remember the critical path of your project. Those are the tasks that directly impact the overall completion date. When you're accelerating, you need to focus on those critical activities, not just the ones that are easy to speed up.
So it's about being strategic and focusing on the things that really matter, not just speeding up everything for the sake of it.
Exactly. Understanding the critical path and how acceleration impacts it is key to making good decisions and getting the most out of your efforts.
All right, listener, that's a lot of information to digest, and we're just getting started. In the next part, we're going to dive into some of the less obvious aspects of acceleration, like those tricky implied instructions and how to handle them effectively. So stick around.
You know, we talked about those implied instructions to accelerate. Well, let's dig a little deeper into that because it can be a bit of a minefield if you're not careful.
Yeah, that one really caught my attention. It sounds like it could get pretty tricky from a legal standpoint. Can you give us an example of what that might look like in a real project?
Okay, imagine this. You've got a project that's running behind, and the employer is starting to feel the heat. Maybe they're facing penalties or some other consequences for those delays. They might not directly tell the contractor to speed things up, but you start to see those hints. Maybe they make comments in meetings, drop those little suggestions in emails, or just give off that vibe that they expect things to move faster.
Ah, I see. So it's like an unspoken pressure to pick up the pace,
Yeah.
even if it's not written in the contract.
Right, and
Oh.
that's where it can get messy. The contractor might feel like they have to accelerate to keep the client happy, even without a clear contract instruction to do so. And that can lead to all sorts of problems down the line, especially when it comes to who's paying for those extra costs and risks.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for conflict. So if our listener is a contractor and they find themselves in this situation, what's the best way to handle it?
The most important thing is clear communication, even if it feels a little awkward. If you're getting those vibes that the employer is pushing for acceleration without giving you a direct instruction, don't be shy about clarifying things.
So being proactive and getting those expectations out in the open before things get out of hand. How do you go about doing that?
The best way is to put everything in writing. So if the employer makes a request, even just a suggestion about speeding things up, confirm it in writing. Send an email, get it documented. That way you've got a clear record of what was said and what was agreed upon. And make sure you clearly outline the scope of any extra work that's needed for acceleration and spell out those extra costs you'll be incurring.
Smart move. Having that paper trail could save you a lot of trouble later on. Always better to be safe than sorry. Okay, let's talk about those acceleration quotations again. I know the RICS guidance has some good advice on that front, right?
They do. One of the things they emphasize is that those quotations need to be more than just a number. You need to break down how you're going to achieve acceleration, what resources you'll need, and justify those extra costs clearly.
So it's not just about saying, hey, this is how much extra it'll cost to finish early. It's about giving them a transparent breakdown of how you're going to make it happen.
Right. Transparency is crucial. The guidance also talks about the importance of thinking about risk allocation when you're putting those quotes together. Who's on the hook if things go wrong during that accelerated work? You need to address that up front.
Yeah, you don't want to get stuck holding the bag if something unexpected happens.
Exactly. And the RICS guidance also talks about those lump sum versus itemized quotations. A lump sum quote might seem simpler, but an itemized quote where you break down each cost can actually give everyone a lot more clarity and can help prevent disagreements in the long run.
It's like that difference between a fixed price menu and ordering a la carte. Sometimes you want to see all those costs spelled out, especially with something as complex as construction.
Good analogy. And, the guidance also mentions those assessments based on actual cost. It's another way to handle the cost side of things.
Oh, tell me more about that. How does that work in practice?
Sometimes you just can't nail down exactly what acceleration is going to cost beforehand. There might be too many unknowns. So in those cases, the parties might agree to figure out the final cost based on what actually gets spent during the acceleration.
So you sort of settle up after the dust settles. What are the challenges with doing it that way?
Well, you need a really clear system for tracking those costs and verifying them. It requires a lot of trust between everyone involved.
That makes sense. You have to be confident that everyone's being honest and upfront about those expenses. Okay, so we've talked about the practical stuff and the contracts. But how do people actually make those decisions about whether or not to accelerate a project? It seems like there's so many things to weigh. How do you even begin to figure that out?
It's a tough call, and there's no easy answer. But the RICS guidance has a really helpful framework for thinking about it strategically. They make it clear that acceleration should always be a deliberate choice, not a knee-jerk reaction when you're feeling pressured.
So take a step back, assess the situation, and then make a decision based on the facts.
Exactly. They lay out some key questions you should ask yourself before you jump into acceleration.
All right, hit me with those questions. I know our listeners are all ears.
The first thing you've got to ask is, does your contract even allow for acceleration? Not all contracts have those provisions. It might seem obvious, but you got to make sure you're playing by the rules.
A good point. You can't accelerate if the contract doesn't allow for it. What else should we be thinking about?
Once you know it's allowed, you need to figure out how you're going to make it happen. What specific actions are you going to take? And think about the impact on your critical path. You don't want to speed up one part of the project just to create a bottleneck somewhere else.
You've got to look at the big picture and make sure you're not creating new problems while you're solving old ones.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have to think about the money. What's it going to cost to hit that earlier completion date? And what are you going to save by finishing early? You need to have a clear understanding of those financial trade-offs.
It's that classic cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
Weigh the potential gains against the potential costs.
Right. And don't forget about the risks. What's the contractor's allowance for risk in all this? What happens if you don't meet that accelerated deadline? You've got to have a plan B.
It's about being prepared for those what-if scenarios.
Exactly. So if you carefully consider all these questions and have open communication with everyone involved, you can make a smart decision about whether or not acceleration is the right move for your project.
That's really helpful advice. It sounds like the RICS guidance is all about giving people the knowledge and tools they need to make those decisions strategically, rather than just reacting to pressure or feeling like they have to rush things.
Exactly. It's about understanding the process, weighing the pros and cons, and making sure everyone's on the same page. But it's also about remembering that construction involves people, and their well-being is important. You can't just sacrifice everything for the sake of speed.
That's a really good point. We've talked a lot about the contracts, the costs, the schedules, but ultimately, it's people who make those projects happen. What about the human impact of all this?
That's something that often gets overlooked, but it's so important. Acceleration can put a huge amount of stress on everyone involved. Workers, managers, supervisors, longer hours, tighter deadlines, more pressure. It can all take a toll.
Right, because it's not just about working faster. It's about the cumulative impact of all those extra demands. It can really affect people's well-being.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to approach acceleration with a focus on both efficiency and well-being. We need to find that balance and make sure that people aren't getting burnt out or putting their health at risk just to meet a deadline. In the next part, we'll talk more about how to achieve that balance and make sure acceleration doesn't come at the cost of people's health and safety.
Well, listener, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into acceleration in UK construction. And let me tell you, it's been quite a journey. From contracts and on-site strategies to those sneaky implied instructions, we've uncovered a lot.
It really makes you realize that speeding things up in construction is way more complicated than it seems at first glance.
You got that right. And as we wrap things up, I want to touch on something we discussed earlier, the human factor in all of this. We've talked about the legal side, the practical side, but ultimately, it's people who are making these projects happen, right? So how do we make sure that acceleration doesn't end up hurting the very people who are building these projects?
That's a really critical point, and you're right, it's often overlooked. Construction is tough work, and adding acceleration into the mix can really pile on the pressure. We have to be aware of how that impacts the people on the ground.
Absolutely. It's not just about working faster. It's those longer hours, those tighter deadlines, that feeling of constant pressure. All of that can take its toll. So what can we actually do to make sure those negative impacts are minimized?
Well, the first thing is communication, plain and simple. Keep everyone in the loop about why you're accelerating, what the new timelines look like, any changes to the work schedule. When people understand the reasons behind it, they're much more likely to be on board and less likely to feel overwhelmed.
I can see that. When you know why something is happening, it's easier to deal with the changes.
Exactly. And beyond just communicating, we need to give people the support they need to handle this accelerated environment. That means giving them the right resources, the training, the tools they need to work safely and efficiently, even under pressure.
So it's about setting people up for success, giving them the tools to handle the challenges of acceleration.
Precisely. And something else that can make a big difference is simply recognizing and appreciating their hard work. A little bit of gratitude can go a long way. When people feel valued, they're much more likely to step up and meet those challenges head on.
That's so true. Sometimes a simple thank you can really make a difference. It seems like responsible acceleration is all about finding that sweet spot, that balance between achieving the project goals and taking care of the people who are actually making it happen.
I think you nailed it. It's about using acceleration strategically, ethically, with a focus on both efficiency and well-being. We need to be accelerating not just our projects, but also our industry's progress toward a more sustainable and human-centered way of working.
Well said. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of acceleration in UK construction. A huge thank you to you for sharing your knowledge and expertise. And to our listener, we encourage you to check out that RICS guidance and put these insights into action on your own projects.
Remember, acceleration doesn't have to be a race to the finish line no matter the cost. It can be a smart, strategic approach that benefits everyone involved.
And on that note, we'll catch you on our next deep dive.